Welcome, and thank you for being here. Tonight, we are going to slow down and step away from the noise of the present. We will travel far back in time, to moments often described as distant, simple, or incomplete. But history, when observed closely, tells a more complex and quietly fascinating story. When we imagine ancient civilizations, we are often taught to see them as early steps in a long journey toward modern knowledge. We picture trial and error, slow progress, and limited understanding. Yet the evidence left behind by these societies suggests something very different. Across the ancient world, people developed knowledge systems that were deeply precise, carefully observed, and thoughtfully recorded. In astronomy, ancient observers tracked the movements of stars and planets with remarkable accuracy, using only the sky and their own patience as tools. In engineering, massive structures were built with mathematical precision that still challenges modern explanations. In medicine, early texts reveal detailed understanding of anatomy, healing plants, and preventative care. And in philosophy, ancient thinkers explored questions about life, purpose, and awareness that remain unresolved even today. This knowledge did not appear suddenly or accidentally. It was the result of generations of observation, shared learning, and cultural continuity. Many ancient societies treated knowledge as something sacred passed down carefully, protected, and respected. Their understanding of the natural world was often holistic, connecting science, art, and belief into a single way of seeing reality. Tonight's story begins with this quiet truth: the ancient world was not ignorant or incomplete. In many ways, it was deeply attentive. And as we move forward, we will begin to see how some of this early knowledge no longer fit the stories modern history preferred to tell and how it slowly faded into the background of time. Modern history often relies on clear timelines. Dates, eras, and stages of progress help us make sense of the past in an orderly way. According to this structure, human knowledge moves forward step by step, gradually becoming more advanced as time passes. Yet some ancient evidence does not sit comfortably within this framework. Across different regions and cultures, traces of sophisticated understanding appear far earlier than expected. Mathematical concepts, astronomical calculations, and engineering precision sometimes emerge thousands of years before they are supposed to exist. These findings do not always rewrite history outright, but they quietly complicate it. They suggest that knowledge may have developed unevenly, advanced rapidly in certain periods, and then faded or fragmented over time. Because these discoveries challenge familiar timelines, they are often explained away as coincidence, exaggeration, or misinterpretation. In some cases, ancient achievements are described as isolated anomalies rather than parts of broader systems of learning. This approach keeps the larger historical narrative intact, but it leaves important questions unanswered. How did such knowledge arise, and why does it appear, disappear, and reappear across different ages? The discomfort comes not from mystery itself, but from what mystery implies. If ancient societies understood more than we assume, then progress is not a straight line. It becomes a series of advances and losses, shaped by environment, culture, and historical disruption. Knowledge may have been built, preserved for centuries, and then slowly forgotten as civilizations declined or priorities changed. Rather than seeing the past as incomplete, these contradictions invite a different perspective. They suggest that ancient knowledge existed within contexts we no longer fully understand. And when that knowledge did not align with modern expectations, it was often placed at the edges of history, acknowledged quietly, but rarely explored in depth. The way history is commonly told favors a simple and reassuring structure. Humanity begins in uncertainty, slowly gathers knowledge, and steadily moves toward improvement. This linear model is easy to teach, easy to remember, and comforting in its sense of direction. But it may not reflect how knowledge truly developed across long stretches of time. Ancient records and physical evidence often point to a more uneven pattern. Periods of remarkable intellectual and technological achievement appear, followed by long intervals of decline, loss, or stagnation. Libraries disappear, skills fade, and complex ideas are reduced to fragments passed down through stories rather than written systems. What survives is not always the most advanced knowledge, but the most resilient or widely shared. Despite this, modern narratives often smooth out these disruptions. Lost knowledge is treated as a temporary pause rather than a significant reversal. Civilizations that decline are framed as stepping stones rather than complete worlds with their own peaks of understanding. This approach preserves the idea that the present is always more informed than the past, even when evidence suggests otherwise. A linear story of progress also shapes how ancient cultures are compared to one another. Later societies are assumed to be superior by default, while earlier ones are seen as preparatory stages. Yet some ancient techniques, observations, and philosophical insights have never been fully replicated, only rediscovered in altered forms. Their disappearance challenges the belief that knowledge naturally accumulates over time. When history prioritizes simplicity over complexity, it risks overlooking how fragile knowledge can be. Ideas are not guaranteed to survive just because they exist. They depend on stable societies, shared values, and careful preservation. Once those conditions are lost, even the most advanced understanding can quietly fade, leaving behind only traces that seem out of place in modern timelines. Across the ancient world, massive structures still stand as silent questions. Stone temples, monuments, and cities were built with a level of precision that appears difficult to reconcile with the tools traditionally attributed to their time. Perfect alignments, complex geometry, and carefully balanced weight suggest planning that went far beyond basic construction. What makes these structures especially puzzling is not just their size, but their accuracy. Stones weighing many tons were shaped, transported, and placed with tight tolerances. Foundations were leveled over vast distances. Angles and proportions followed mathematical principles that implied careful measurement and advanced planning. In many cases, these achievements were repeated consistently, not as rare experiments, but as standard practice. Modern explanations often focus on labor and time, suggesting that enough workers and enough years can overcome almost any challenge. While effort certainly played a role, this view does not fully address the level of coordination and technical understanding required. Large groups do not automatically produce precision. Precision requires systems, shared knowledge, and methods refined through experience. Another challenge lies in the absence of detailed records. Many ancient builders left behind finished works, but not the instructions used to create them. The techniques may have been transmitted orally, protected within specialized groups, or lost during periods of upheaval. As a result, modern observers are left with outcomes without clear explanations. These architectural achievements do not demand dramatic reinterpretations of history, but they do invite caution. They suggest that ancient societies possessed practical knowledge that does not fit neatly into modern assumptions about technological development. When such knowledge cannot be easily categorized, it is often treated as an exception rather than evidence of broader understanding. The buildings remain, enduring quietly. They do not explain themselves, yet they continue to challenge the idea that ancient construction was guided only by trial and error, reminding us that skill and knowledge can exist without leaving behind written proof. Long before modern instruments existed, ancient societies spent countless nights observing the sky. They watched patterns repeat, lights shift, and seasons change in response to movements above them. Over time, these careful observations became structured systems of knowledge, recorded in stone, architecture, and symbolic language. Across different continents, ancient sites reveal precise alignments with celestial events. Structures were positioned to mark solstices, equinoxes, and significant lunar cycles. These alignments were not random. They required long-term observation, accurate measurement, and an understanding of predictable cosmic rhythms. In some cases, a single error in angle would have rendered the alignment meaningless. Yet the results remain remarkably consistent. What is striking is the shared accuracy across cultures that had no known contact with one another. Similar methods of tracking time, mapping stars, and predicting seasonal changes appear independently. This suggests that ancient people were not simply reacting to nature, but actively studying it with patience and intention. Modern narratives often describe this knowledge as symbolic or ritualistic, separating it from scientific thinking. Yet symbolism and precision were not opposites in the ancient world. Meaning and measurement existed side by side. The sky was both a source of wonder and a reliable system that could be studied, understood, and anticipated. The challenge arises when this level of accuracy appears earlier than expected. Complex astronomical cycles were recognized long before the tools we associate with such calculations. Rather than revising timelines, these discoveries are sometimes framed as coincidence or intuitive guessing. But repeated precision suggests method, not chance. These ancient observations remind us that science does not begin with machines. It begins with attention. The sky offered patterns to anyone willing to watch closely enough, generation after generation. And in doing so, ancient civilizations developed a knowledge of the cosmos that still quietly shapes how we measure time. Today, ancient medical knowledge is often described as primitive, limited by superstition and incomplete anatomy. Yet surviving texts and practices suggest a far more careful and observant approach to healing. Long before modern laboratories, ancient societies studied the human body through experience, pattern recognition, and close interaction with the natural world. Medical writings from different regions describe symptoms, treatments, and preventative practices with surprising clarity. Illness was not always seen as a single event, but as a process influenced by environment, diet, and lifestyle. This holistic perspective allowed healers to identify recurring conditions and develop consistent responses over time. Botanical knowledge was especially refined. Thousands of plants were categorized according to their effects, preparation methods, and safe usage. Some remedies addressed pain, infection, or inflammation in ways that align with later scientific findings. This knowledge required careful experimentation, observation of outcomes, and the ability to distinguish between helpful and harmful substances. What makes this understanding difficult to place within modern narratives is its depth without formal theory. Ancient healers did not explain their work using chemical formulas or standardized terminology, yet their results were often reliable enough to be preserved and repeated. The absence of modern language does not indicate the absence of method. Much of this knowledge was transmitted orally, within families or specialized groups. When social structures changed or cultures collapsed, these traditions were easily disrupted. Written records were lost, and practices that once took generations to refine disappeared quietly. Rather than viewing ancient medicine as a rough beginning, it may be more accurate to see it as a parallel system of knowledge. One rooted in observation rather than abstraction and effectiveness rather than explanation. Its gradual disappearance reflects not failure, but the fragility of knowledge when its context is lost. Ancient philosophical traditions often addressed questions that remained central to human thought. They explored the nature of consciousness, the meaning of a good life, and the relationship between individuals and the world around them. These ideas were not abstract distractions, but practical frameworks for understanding existence. Across different cultures, similar themes appear. Thinkers reflected on awareness, balance, responsibility, and the limits of knowledge. Rather than seeking final answers, many traditions emphasized observation, self-discipline, and long-term reflection. Wisdom was treated as a process, not a destination. What challenges modern narratives is the depth of these ideas relative to their age. Some ancient texts describe mental states, ethical dilemmas, and social dynamics with a subtlety that still feels relevant. The language may differ, but the insights resonate because the underlying human experience has not changed. Modern philosophy often separates reason from intuition, logic from experience. Ancient systems rarely made this distinction. Thought, behavior, and perception were intertwined. Understanding the world required understanding oneself, and moral clarity was seen as a form of knowledge, not merely opinion. These philosophies were not always preserved in stable conditions. Many survived through fragments, translations, or reinterpretations shaped by later values. As a result, their original context is often blurred, and their complexity reduced. What remains can appear vague or symbolic when removed from the systems that supported it. Yet even in fragmented form, these ideas continue to surface in modern debates. Questions about identity, awareness, and ethical responsibility remain open. The persistence of these themes suggests that ancient philosophy was not an early draft of modern thought, but a sophisticated response to questions that have never been fully resolved. Knowledge has never existed in isolation. It has always been influenced by those who held authority over education, belief, and record-keeping. In many ancient societies, ideas that aligned with dominant systems were preserved, while others gradually faded from official history. When belief structures became formalized, certain explanations of the world were favored over alternatives. Knowledge that supported existing hierarchies was reinforced through teaching and repetition. Meanwhile, ideas that raised uncomfortable questions or challenged established order were often ignored, simplified, or reframed. This process did not require deliberate erasure. Over time, repetition alone was enough to shape memory. Texts were copied selectively. Interpretations were standardized. What did not fit prevailing values slowly lost visibility. As generations passed, absence itself became proof that certain ideas had never mattered. The effect is subtle but lasting. Historical records begin to reflect agreement rather than debate. Complexity gives way to clarity, even if that clarity is incomplete. Knowledge becomes more manageable, but also narrower. What survives is often what was easiest to teach, not what was most nuanced. This shaping of knowledge can be seen across different cultures and eras. Shifts in power often coincided with shifts in what was considered legitimate understanding. Practices once treated as foundational were reclassified as symbolic or outdated. Their practical dimensions were overlooked. Rather than viewing ancient knowledge as lost through accident alone, it may be more accurate to see it as filtered. What we inherit is not a full record of what existed, but a record of what was allowed to remain visible. Understanding this process helps explain why certain forms of ancient knowledge feel incomplete, not because they lacked depth, but because their context was quietly narrowed over time. The way ancient history is interpreted often depends on who is doing the interpreting. As modern academic systems developed, they brought with them specific cultural assumptions about progress, intelligence, and legitimacy. These assumptions shaped how ancient knowledge was categorized and evaluated. Histories were often written through a narrow lens, emphasizing certain regions while minimizing others. Achievements that fit familiar frameworks were highlighted, while unfamiliar systems of knowledge were treated as peripheral or symbolic. Over time, this created an uneven record, where some civilizations appeared central and others appeared secondary, regardless of their actual influence. Translation played a key role in this process. Ancient texts were filtered through modern language and concepts that did not always capture their original meaning. Ideas grounded in lived experience or oral tradition were especially vulnerable to distortion. What could not be easily translated into modern terms was often simplified or dismissed. This perspective shaped educational narratives for generations. Students learned a version of history that felt cohesive but incomplete. Knowledge that did not align with dominant cultural values was framed as curiosity rather than contribution. As a result, ancient understanding from many regions remained underexplored. Re-examining these perspectives does not require replacing one narrative with another. It requires recognizing that historical interpretation is not neutral. Every framework highlights some details while obscuring others. Awareness of this process allows space for a more balanced understanding. When ancient knowledge is viewed from multiple cultural perspectives, patterns emerge that were previously overlooked. Similar insights appear across distant societies, suggesting shared human curiosity rather than isolated brilliance. This broader view challenges the idea that meaningful knowledge followed a single path. and instead reveals a diverse landscape shaped by many voices. Not all knowledge disappears because it is rejected or misunderstood. Sometimes it vanishes simply because the conditions that sustained it no longer exist. Ancient knowledge systems depended on continuity, stable communities, shared practices, and careful transmission across generations. When societies faced disruption, this continuity was fragile. Centers of learning declined, skilled practitioners were displaced, and oral traditions were interrupted. Without regular use and teaching, even complex knowledge could fade within a few generations. What survived was often fragmented, stripped of the context that once gave it meaning. Written records offered some protection, but they were not immune. Materials decayed, languages evolved, and texts required active copying to remain accessible. When copying stopped, knowledge quietly slipped out of reach. In many cases, later generations encountered these texts without understanding the cultural systems that shaped them. Oral traditions were even more vulnerable. They relied on memory, practice, and social structure. Once those structures changed, the knowledge they carried became difficult to preserve. What remained were stories without instruction, symbols without explanation. Modern history often treats these gaps as natural limitations of the past. Yet they reflect how dependent knowledge is on human systems. Ideas do not preserve themselves. They require care, repetition, and relevance. Understanding this fragility changes how ancient knowledge is viewed. Its absence does not imply inferiority or failure. It suggests that knowledge, like culture itself, can be disrupted, scattered, and partially recovered. What we encounter today are remnants, not because ancient understanding was incomplete, but because the conditions that supported it could not always endure. In some cases, ideas once recorded in ancient sources resurface centuries later through modern research. What was previously viewed as symbolic, intuitive, or speculative begins to align with contemporary understanding. These moments do not suggest that ancient knowledge replaced modern science, but that careful observation can lead to similar conclusions across different eras. Ancient descriptions of natural cycles, environmental balance, and human behavior often reflect patterns that are now studied systematically. When modern tools confirm these patterns, the ancient ideas gain new relevance. They are no longer treated as historical curiosities, but as early expressions of insight shaped by long-term attention. This process of rediscovery highlights an important distinction. Ancient knowledge was often practical rather than theoretical. It focused on outcomes, relationships, and lived experience. Modern science, by contrast, emphasizes measurement, replication, and formal explanation. When the two intersect, it becomes clear that different methods can approach the same reality. These overlaps are sometimes unexpected. Concepts dismissed for generations may suddenly appear familiar under new terminology. What changes is not the idea itself, but the framework used to understand it. Once placed within a modern context, ancient insights can be evaluated rather than overlooked. This does not mean every ancient claim holds up under scrutiny. Some ideas remain symbolic or culturally specific. But the act of rediscovery challenges the assumption that earlier knowledge was entirely replaced by modern advancement. Instead, it suggests continuity beneath apparent progress. Knowledge evolves, but it also circles back. When ancient insights resurface, they remind us that understanding is not owned by any one era. It emerges wherever careful observation, reflection, and patience are allowed to unfold over time. The story of ancient knowledge is shaped as much by selection as by discovery. History does not record everything equally. It preserves what fits established narratives and gradually sidelines what feels uncertain or difficult to categorize. Over time, this process creates the illusion of completeness. What survives in textbooks and timelines often appears stable and well-defined. Yet beneath that surface lies a vast field of partial records, unanswered questions, and overlooked connections. Ancient knowledge that did not align with later frameworks was not always rejected outright. More often, it was quietly simplified or left unexplored. This selective memory affects how the past is understood. When only certain forms of knowledge are emphasized, the diversity of ancient thought becomes less visible. Contributions from different cultures, methods, and perspectives fade into the background, even when their influence remains. Recognizing this does not undermine history. It deepens it. It allows space for uncertainty and invites curiosity rather than final judgment. The past becomes a living conversation rather than a closed account. Ancient knowledge, then, is not defined by what was lost alone, but by what was filtered. What remains is shaped by human choices, what was valued, preserved, and repeated. Understanding this process encourages a more patient view of history, one that accepts gaps without filling them too quickly. In the quiet spaces between what is recorded and what is missing, ancient knowledge continues to speak softly. Not as a challenge to the present, but as a reminder that understanding is always incomplete, and that what we remember is only one part of a much larger story. To close this journey, it helps to step back and look at the story as a whole. Ancient knowledge does not sit neatly in the past, sealed off from the present. It lingers in fragments, patterns, and quiet rediscoveries. What we have explored is not a claim that the past was superior, nor that modern understanding is incomplete, but that knowledge has never moved in a straight, predictable line. Across time, ideas have been built, lost, filtered, and reshaped. Some were preserved because they fit the needs of later societies. Others faded because their context disappeared or their meaning became difficult to translate. What remains is only a portion of what once existed, shaped by memory, power, and circumstance. Recognizing this does not weaken our understanding of history. It invites patience and humility. It reminds us that certainty is rare, and that curiosity is often more valuable than simple answers. The past still has quiet lessons to offer, not as mysteries to solve, but as perspectives to consider. Thank you for spending this time exploring these ideas. If you found this story calming or thought-provoking, you are always welcome to return. Until next time, take care, rest well, and have a peaceful night.